Dan, do you know how to make that into a bar? Yeah.
What are we eating, people? Hey, it's good enough. Wins.
Yeah. Quite a few people really different than I get the things and
Not gonna sneak up on anybody in those shoes.
I try to give everybody fair warning, you know.
nice.
Yeah. It's like safety first, you know, it's like safety vests, high visibility stuff, right? Yeah, don't get, well, at least I figure if I get run over in a crosswalk, I'll have a good defense because the shoes should have told somebody, hey, there's somebody in the crosswalk. I met someone this morning crossing a crosswalk and who was stepping in and the car was approaching and didn't bother to even stop. And she just looked like this. She was like this. And she walked over, she said, people don't stop. Said, you have to be careful. Don't take it for granted.
Depends on the time of the day too.
Well, this wasn't rush hours. It was.
It's sunrise if you're driving.
There's no sun issue. This was not a sun issue. This was somebody not paying attention to somebody ready to step into the street.
Seriously, punch.
Sure.
Jack, it's a little bit too.
Me.
What does, no, I'm texting, but yeah.
It's like you. So fortunately, it's not an incident, just the roll your eyes kind of thing.
Hey, good evening. Welcome to the City of Ellensburg study session for October 6, 2025. We're going to talk code enforcement.
Absolutely. So I'm going to introduce this very briefly. I want to talk a little bit about code enforcement. This is an opportunity for an overview. Cities do code enforcement, but it's a really difficult thing to do. Our job, you as council, you help support the quality of life, our public health and safety and economic development. Council makes, you pass ordinances, so you're making local laws and provisions for enforcing those laws. A lot of what we do actually crosses many different sections. We have enforcement provisions in our code that impact some of our buildings, that impact our nuisances, how tall your grass can be, our stormwater ponds, and so a variety of services. And so we have some people who care very deeply about this, but this is a really difficult topic to do and to do well as a city. We've made some changes. You're going to hear all about the tools that we have and some of the challenges that we have with code enforcement and about what are some changes coming up in the future we'd like to explore with council as policies. So we have Chris Horner and we have another team of folks here to help present this item tonight.
Council, Chris Horner, City Attorney. We're here to talk about code enforcement. So a quick overview of the discussion. We'll talk about the code enforcement process, some of the legal authority that we have to create code in the first place. And by code, I mean city code. We'll talk about enforcement options and challenges. And then we've got case examples from stormwater, community development, and Ellensburg Police Department to talk about some of the code enforcement challenges in reality. And then at the end, if we have time, there'll be some questions and discussion, but please feel free to just ask questions whenever you have them. To start out, what is code enforcement? And the simplest definition I found is just the process the city uses to enforce state law and most importantly, the city code and ordinances. So every time council passes an ordinance, that's local law. And how do we get folks to comply with it? The ideal is that folks voluntarily comply and just do what you say because they're good citizens. What is code enforcement? It also encompasses, like Heidi said, many different areas of activity. I won't read all of those, but you can see it just runs the gamut from snow and ice removal from the sidewalk to zoning, unsafe buildings, business operations, overgrown and unkempt vegetation and trees. It's just anything that people do and that there's a law for, we have to figure out a way to enforce it. The legal authority to create codes starts with the Washington Constitution, and that's cities can make any laws within its limits that touch on police, sanitary, and other regulations, as long as it doesn't conflict with state and other law. So it's quite broad authority. In reality, the state has preempted many fields of laws, but still it is pretty broad regulatory authority the city council has. There's a statute that says similar that you can adopt and enforce ordinances. You can impose penalties that include fine or imprisonment if it doesn't exceed 1 year. So this is the first citation I have for Ellensburg City Code. And this is a general chapter of city code that can apply to basically any part of city code. And that gives you some enforcement tools, some provisions on violations and penalties. So this is a general enforcement chapter of the city code. And that allows you to institute monetary penalties for folks that violate. It has a hearing process. If someone disagrees with the penalty that we're imposing, they can appeal it to a hearings examiner. This section of City Code 5.40.020 specifically relates to nuisances. And that's different than the general city code that we just talked about. Nuisance relates more to injury, illness, devaluation of property, crime, affects the rights of the greater community. It's a public health, safety, and welfare issue. So not all violations of the city code touch on public health, safety, and welfare. But those that do, there's a section in city code that talks about nuisances. And so in my mind, I've figured we have the general city code 1.80 that we just talked about. That's a general enforcement chapter of city code. And then we have nuisances, which is its own section of city code. Both have options for us to proceed to enforce violations. Nuisance is also defined under state law 7.48.120. So we have the city code that in two different places talks about being able to enforce city code. But what does that mean to enforce city code? And this slide has bullet points for different options we have to try to get people to to comply with our local ordinances. And the first stop is voluntary compliance. So often when our city staff goes and talks to a property owner and says, hey, your trees are infringing on the right of way, folks will just take care of it because they want to comply with city code. And that's the end of the enforcement action. It was just a simple conversation with the property owner. It takes a few minutes of staff time, but again, the ideal is that property owners just take care of their own issues. That's the least city resource way of enforcing code. If a conversation doesn't do it, there's something called a voluntary correction agreement. It's basically a contract that staff would sign with the property owner where the document says to the property owner, this is the violation. This is what you need to do to fix it. Please sign here. And it's a written document that if the homeowner doesn't comply, then we've got a document we could enforce in court or in front of the hearings examiner. if the voluntary correction agreement doesn't work, and again, the voluntary correction agreement is again a contract trying to get the property owner to voluntarily take care of the problem. If that doesn't work, another option is there's a notice of civil violation. It's an official document saying you're in violation of our city code. Sometimes that gets people's attention where nothing else will. If the city staff determines that there's an emergency that's like a tree just about to fall that would hurt property or people, we can in emergency go in and take care of the problem, but that is for emergencies only. And that's a pretty tough threshold for the city staff to meet. We wouldn't want to rush in and just take care of any old problem because the Fourth Amendment against going onto people's property does apply, but it would be an exception if there's an emergency. Another option is going to district court. It's you can do a civil infraction, which is kind of the same level of severity as a traffic ticket. Fines can come from that, or a misdemeanor criminal charge. A criminal charge carries the higher burden of proof in district court to prove an actual criminal case. The property owner would probably have the right to an attorney, a defense attorney, and so you can have a discussion on whether having someone get a criminal charge is helpful when we want them to comply, but that's a conversation to have. And then the last bullet there talks about a civil court lawsuit to abate a nuisance, and that's a civil lawsuit where you go and ask the Superior Court judge for an order allowing the city to go in and take care of the problem, whether that's hauling off the trash. If it's an unpermitted structure, you can get an order allowing the city to knock down that structure and haul it away. And then there are provisions for this abatement lawsuit for the city to recoup its costs in terms of a lien on the property. And we'll see in a later slide, we can do a special assessment on the property. So with these bullet points, I would note that this isn't necessarily need to be in sequential order, that you have to go from one to the other. It depends on the circumstances, which of those you use. And sometimes it does make sense to just jump straight to a lawsuit in Superior Court. But these are some of the options just outlined in a bullet point list. I talked about some criminal law violations, some civil law violations. This slide attempts to distinguish between criminal law and civil law for any folks that may not be familiar with it. One way I think about it is criminal law is just a statute that says this is a criminal violation if it's violated, and there are imprisonment is a remedy. Anything that's not listed as a crime falls under civil law. So you've got your list of crimes, and then everything else is a civil violation. Criminal law has a higher burden of proof. Most people are familiar with the phrase beyond a reasonable doubt. That's much harder for the city to prove than a civil burden of proof, which is preponderance of the evidence. In the civil case, the defendant does not have a right to an attorney. There's no direct jail or prison terms in a civil case. So this slide just is referencing the part of city code where staff starts the code enforcement process with looking for voluntary compliance from the property owner. The slide sets forth the voluntary correction agreement, which is that a contract that we sign with the property owner to get them to comply. This slide sets forth the city code that talks about civil violations. There's the citation to the general enforcement provision of city code, that's 1.80. And then the nuisance section of code has a similar notice of civil violation option. And this slide talks about the ability to appeal a civil violation to a hearings examiner. Slide talks about the ability for the city to go in an emergent basis to deal with public health, safety, welfare issues, both under the general enforcement section and the nuisance section. This goes into more detail on what a district court action might look like, civil infractions, fines, misdemeanor criminal charges. And then this sets forth some of the provisions for going to Superior Court to abate a nuisance. One of the helpful things in that city code is it allows the city to also recoup reasonable attorney's fees. So if you have to hire a law firm to handle the lawsuit, we might be able to get our costs back from that. So here's more detail on cost recovery. The fines that we have in city code range from anywhere from $100 a day up to $1,000 per day for some of the nuisances. We can send a bill invoice to the property owner to try to get the city's money back. We can put a lien on the property. If the property owner doesn't pay, we can send it to collection agency to try to get that to get our payment. And then there's an ability, if we have over $2,000 of costs, we can put a lien on that, which would be a special assessment with the same rank of property taxes. And we could enter into agreement with the county treasurer to have them collect that special assessment with the county property taxes. And if they didn't pay, then theoretically we could foreclose on the property. So these are pretty potent remedies. Of course, it takes staff time to navigate all of them, but they are tools that we have available to us. So challenges in code enforcement start with workload. Just there are so many code enforcement issues out there. How does staff prioritize which ones to deal with and address? I see my face is blocking some of the words up there, but that's just talking about sometimes you can enforce with a short conversation with the property owner, and that's the preference, or do you have to go and sue them in Superior Court and spend years litigating? And with all the different areas of code enforcement in city code, there's some overlapping duties and responsibilities where more than one department may be responsible for enforcing the code. One thing that comes to mind is vegetation. Depending on the violation, it could be the fire department, community development, the police department may all have something to do with overgrown vegetation, and trying to figure out which staff and which department handles is one of the challenges. And so to help address that, we created and this happened before I was here, they created a code enforcement team meeting where once a month, all the different departments get together to talk about code enforcement issues, what's going on in their department, who's handling it. If it touches on more than one department, just trying to talk through the issues. And that's been helpful. As you may have seen with the slides, we have a bunch of different city code that talks about code enforcement and how to enforce. And it was spread throughout the city code, these different enforcement provisions. And I put them in the slide. I mean, not to torture you all with all of it, but just to help me understand where the code enforcement provisions are. And so one of the things we're thinking about in the future is there any cleanup we need to do for city code to make it more straightforward for enforcement? I don't know that we have the specific proposal in front of council on what needs to change. We may want to go through a couple of code enforcement cases before we have that conversation, but that's something to think about for perhaps in the future. We may want a software system to help us track the case status so the different departments can figure out what needs to happen next, where we're at in any specific case. Another challenge is just costs. It takes time and money to go to property owners and have them try to take care of their problems. Civil litigation is expensive. So for costs, one of the things that we would do to move forward with code enforcement is create a city revolving fund. We did that at the county where the commissioners put up a pot of money into a revolving fund, and that money would be used to fund abatement actions. And as we recouped money from code enforcement, that money would go back into the revolving fund and could be used to handle future code enforcement problems. And then the last bold section up there, complaint-based code enforcement. And so when staff sees, does code enforcement happen based on what staff sees when they're driving throughout the city, or do we wait to hear from citizens what violations they think are worthy of complaint and address those? And so complaint-based code enforcement is just you wait to hear who you track complaints as they come in and address those. More proactive would be staff would see different violations as they're out and about town, and it depends on what type of code enforcement issue, whether it makes sense to be complaint-based or handle it differently. And with that, I will turn it over to Rebecca to talk about stormwater.
Are there any questions at this point? No, okay.
Good evening, Council. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you so much. Starting a case example with a stormwater example. So in this location, you can see running north to south, we had the Cascade irrigation line that then intersects with city stormwater infrastructure running east-west at the bottom of the photograph. So there was a city stormwater system that was used to convey irrigation water across private property. The way that was constructed, it was an 18-inch installed per plan line on the east side of the horizontal line. And the area that's thickened in a little bit of a blue highlight was an area where the property owner modified what was an open channel. So initially when that was constructed, it was an 18-inch pipe, flowed through an open channel, continued on and provided irrigation water downstream. When that was modified, the open channel was filled in and an 8-inch pipe was kind of connected to that 18-inch pipe, which created a necking down situation and inappropriately sized conveyance. So that backed up to the irrigation box that you see at the lower right corner of the screen. So there were, through the solid lid, there was water bubbling out into the street, into the catch basins, and then draining to storm ponds that were designated for other purposes. So that overall, I'd say from start to finish, took about 2 years total. The period of time that elapsed between the cease and desist letter that was sent was about 1 year of stormwater staff follow-up to achieve a successful remedial action, which occurred in a number of stages. So there was initial remediation where the property owner removed approximately half of that undersized pipe. And that didn't solve the problem. The next season, it continued to be an issue. So there were more communications that followed up, and finally the entire portion in blue was removed and it was returned to an open channel. So, many correspondence elements with the homeowner, conversations between the current property owner and the one prior who supposedly was the one who initiated that action. Any questions about that case? Thank you.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. Dan Carlson, Community Development Director. So the kind of code enforcement cases that we see in community development are things like building without a permit, uses that aren't allowed in a zoning district, grade and fill without a permit, or like unsafe structures. So this is not a specific example. This is a kind of a hypothetical scenario, the kind of things that we would see in there where we have challenges. The majority of the time, we are able to get voluntary compliance. We let a landowner know that there's a violation. We are able to get them to fix that most of the time, but the real challenges come when we don't get that kind of voluntary compliance. So in this scenario, there's a structure that's damaged and we believe that it's uninhabitable. It doesn't have to be as obvious as this picture here, but there's a lot of ways that we find out through complaints or things we can see from the right of way, or sometimes we can't. And that was the example I used here, is where we believe it to be uninhabitable, but maybe we can't get a good look at it. We have complaints that we've received, or we've had notification that we've received from EPD that people are maybe living in the structure. We get their report, and so we've got a pretty good idea about that there is a violation going on there. We reach out to the landowner to try to assess it and try to start working towards compliance, and the landowner doesn't cooperate. A lot of times they'll ask for more time, or kind of put that issue off. Or in this case, in the scenario here, the building official asked for an inspection to get a look at that. And then we never heard from the landowner again. So we've got a case where we didn't get that voluntary compliance. We have reason to believe that there's unsafe conditions that exist there. And then, what do we do next? And that's where we get into those areas that Chris was discussing earlier, fines and infractions, and the kind of things that it might take a search warrant. We might have to coordinate to get a search warrant and get that inspection done. But really to find a way to, in this case, compel the landowner to fix the violation. And so that's really the biggest challenge is you've seen all the tools that Chris put up there, but it's how do we encourage the landowner to do that, or get that court order that requires compliance. That's it for that example. Any questions on that? Going on.
Good evening, council. Can you hear me okay? Yep. Okay, thanks for having us. This is Addison Johnson, our code enforcement, one of our 2 code enforcement officers. We just have a couple examples. We're not going to take up a huge amount of your time. These are a couple of the residences or properties that we have dealt with or are currently still dealing with that kind of fall into what Chris was talking about. And this current property, just as a preface, we didn't put addresses in there. We didn't put any names in there. Not trying to single anybody out. And really, again, to reaffirm, we would love compliance off of our initial conversations and initial notices before we ever do any kind of enforcement. But this is a residence that we have dealt with for some time, numerous years, and we've cited criminally twice. Oops, sorry. I'm going the wrong direction. Eventually, this tenant passed away. And so the property has since been sold and cleaned up. So this is no longer an issue, but this was on a main thoroughfare within town. And you can just imagine the code violations and what that deals with, what the neighbors deal with, what kind of potential rodent problem that comes from that. So it is a situation that we definitely need to take care of.
Real quick, I'm sorry, on
Yes, sir.
that last image, I'm hearing you say that the code violation has to do with more of a health and safety situation and a little bit of life safety. Is that?
I would say it was multifaceted. Yeah, it clearly I can let Addison speak to that, but the rubbish and debris pileup was more significant.
Yeah, so what you can see from this picture here, the right picture is when I cited them. The left side is when we started contact with them. It's kind of harder to see just because the pictures are from far back and this is a 3,500 square foot property. The whole property itself was covered in all of this stuff, so it spans between, I believe he probably had unsecured garbage in there, but he had household items. You can't store out like household furniture and things of that sort, just because rodents in the winter can get in there and they like to burrow and find things. He had machinery on that property, like I know there was a washing machine. You can't have things like that outside because when it gets cold outside, sometimes people get desperate and we don't want them to accidentally end up inside of a washing machine or a freezer or a refrigerator. When that hasn't happened yet, thank God, but we don't want to present that opportunity for somebody. And a large part of his too was he had wood and it wasn't organized, it was just randomly piled, which is prohibited against city code. It's not that we require a certain organization for it, but we don't allow a large of, I believe, of it being stored. I can't recall correctly right now the language that it is, but this property owner would have lots and lots of wood, and then he would go collect, in the left picture, there's a mattress. He's got lots of different things that he had all over there. And so it's more so, it's like Sergeant Bender said, it's a multifaceted thing, but it's something that we don't want to potentially risk to have happening.
And fire would have notified law enforcement on this one. Probably did.
Yes. So this is we have a few slides of a west end of Ellensburg residence that has abandoned trailers, bags and bags and bags of rubbish and piled debris, fire hazards, as well as living conditions, no running water, no plumbing, no power, any of that. Couple more photos of the residents. The residents had been through a fire. So you can see in the left picture, the tarp on the roof. So all the utilities have been pulled. A very extensive report was conducted by KVFR about it being uninhabitable and condemned, but we still had people living and residing on the premise. We had criminal activity going on the premise as well. So this is a property that's still ongoing, that we're still having problems with getting compliance. And this is a property kind of southwest area of town that was recently annexed. There was, when it was annexed, the county's code enforcement handed us a very thick folder.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, I think they did. But this is just another example of non-operational machinery, clutter, debris, definite hazards, and not within our code. Multiple pictures, different angles, and that's still how it is, today. So, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I have a follow-up question real quick. So thank you for these images, and you kind of touched on something that I was gonna ask was, as far as our code, is it pretty in line with what the county has? Are we stricter, the same, less strict as far as our code, the codes that we have and the enforcement?
I don't have an answer on off the top of my head how it's city and county code specifically relate to each other, but I think between all the different code provisions we have in city code, we have the tools that we need, same tools that the county has. Whether they could be organized a little bit differently, more streamlined, that's an open conversation. But I think at the end of the day, we have the tools that we need in the city code, the same that the county does.
Yeah.
And I would say one main difference between city and county is city, we have more density. And so
Yes.
oftentimes we sort of have urban type standards. And so there might be a higher level of standards about property conditions and nuisances than counties would typically have.
So can I ask a related question? Because I've seen this in town a bit, and I don't know if it's a code violation, but along the same lines of a collection of non-functional equipment, et cetera. It's fairly common in Ellensburg to see people park cars on their yard, on their grass. Sometimes they're up on blocks, sometimes they're just pushed over out of the way. Do you have a lot of experience with that? And what's the motivation for people to get their junk cleaned up?
So city.
Go to the microphone, Addison.
So the city code does allow one inoperable vehicle to be stored on somebody's property. So if they have one junk car that's in their front yard and they'd like to keep it there, the city does not have an issue with that per city code. It's when we start seeing multiple vehicles and it has to be something that I can prove that's clearly and apparently inoperable, not just something that you see somebody left their parked car on their private property and they have 5 parked cars. We're looking at things like, okay, there's not a motor in that one. There are no tires on that car and it's missing probably a trunk and maybe a windshield, and it has to look like something that is very clearly, maybe it's somebody's project car, but it's not something that I deal with very often just because people typically don't in Ellensburg, from what I've seen, have very inoperable vehicles just sitting in their front yard. And part of what I deal with too, it has to be seen from the public right of way. So if somebody were to keep that in their backyard and I can't see it from the public right of way, it's not something that I can deal with.
So with those scenarios, is that like most code enforcement complaint driven, or is it just casual observation by officers, for example, or both?
It would be both, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Those are the slides that we have for you. Any other questions? I'm happy to take them. But lastly, I mean, we are both proactive and reactive. And there's a lot of different facets to the Ellensburg Police Department's code division. So
Do you mind?
So I have,
Go ahead.
I have a question about that proactive versus reactive. How do you decide and where do you draw the line? So, I mean, I've had folks approach me and say, City of Ellensburg should be much more proactive about enforcing weeds and trees and junk, and it's about quality of life, but also what appearance do you want to project to newcomers to the community, especially if it's on a main thoroughfare. And so I know that we are mostly complaint driven, but then, I mean, are there certain things that you look for that rise to a higher level, or, you know, like, and snow and ice on sidewalks? You know, we have a code that says you have to shovel it, but does it take a neighbor to complain, or if you see it, do you approach the landowner?
no, it doesn't take a neighbor to complain about it. I think we prioritize that by safety. So slips, trips and falls, the snow and ice removal is something that our code enforcement does take seriously and do numerous contacts throughout the year. And 99% of the time we get compliance. So it's not an issue. As far as other things that you were talking about, as far as weeds and obscured, you know, trees obscuring, things like that, it's all, again, safety things, because the weeds can be a fire hazard. We live in a dry climate. So, you know, things like that. But the biggest thing is we just try and be reasonable, and we try and get compliance out of conversations and contacts before we ever get to an enforcement role.
Great.
Add one more thing is, you might get a different answer depending on which department you talk about. The police department is very proactive. Some of the other departments are more complaint based. And so that might be part of the conversation too.
And I would just note that that's really a resource issue. We've intentionally had code enforcement resources, very dedicated resources. They also do parking enforcement in the police department. And so we have more capacity. And again, we have 2 full-time officers that do this. In our other departments, we have a pretty thin staff and a lot of people do a lot of different things. And as it was mentioned, a lot of these cases are sticky cases. They're pretty difficult to sort the pieces out and to gain compliance. And so we're working hard to continue coordinating those efforts through our code enforcement team and through our interdepartmental work.
Yes, sir.
Quick question. What proactive co-compliance does, what proactive co-compliance does EPD deal with the most? And then if you do get complaints, which co-compliance issue do you deal with the most? I'm just curious.
I would say most of our code compliance has to do with vehicles, for the most part, and those are probably the easiest thing that we have to deal with. So most vehicles are at least in running order. Are people living in vehicles right now, is a pretty significant issue. So we deal with that, pretty much on a daily basis.
I had a quick question. I have a question on noxious weeds, but the vehicle parking made me think, I think somewhere deep in the ordinances, the code somewhere, there's something that in residential neighborhoods, there's something that limits the amount of time people can park their personal vehicles on the public street for extended periods of time, isn't there or not?
It's within the entire city limits of
Yeah.
Ellensburg.
Yeah,
If
yeah.
they're on the public right of way, they're supposed to be no more than a 24-hour park.
Okay, so complaint driven, and I see people.
That one is mainly complaint.
Yeah, I see people in different neighborhoods, including my own, with boats on trailers that are there for long periods of time, RVs, and, I don't know, it's sort of like the other questions, at what point does it rise to being, well, you're gonna complain about your neighbor every other week kind of thing? I don't know. My lead question was, what's the, is there any overlap or intersection, or are there referrals between our city resources and the noxious weed board? Because we get complaints about noxious weeds, but I think the tendency is to refer people to the noxious weed board. But I was curious, and maybe it's city of Ellensburg versus out of the city, or both. I don't know.
Typically, we don't deal with noxious weeds, so we will always refer to the noxious weed board.
So the overgrown debris in yards is not specifically related to noxious weeds, but if you find them, you'll refer them. Okay, thank you. Thanks, that's all I had.
So when you get a situation like is in these pictures here, do you ever get it cleaned up?
Yes, I think the potential is there. I will say the abatement process is something that we have rarely used. I've been here 27 years and I was part of an abatement as a reserve just prior to being hired. So I don't recall any other ones within the city limits of Ellensburg within that time frame. And I may have missed one or two, but it is, I guess what I'm getting at is very rare. Most of the time we're able to get compliance one way or another, but normally doesn't go through the abatement process.
So what's the threshold? How long do
Yeah.
you try voluntary compliance before we use a hammer?
That would be on a case-by-case basis, dependent on the property. Typically, we look at what is the violation, where is it at, what is going on, because people are people, they have lives, they have things that affect them. So sometimes I may say, hey, I noticed this, I can give you 2 weekends, but they just, tomorrow they fall and they break their leg and now they can't do anything for a month, right? So it's very much circumstance dependent. Most of these cases, I believe we gave about a year, but that was multiple contacts. So it wasn't just, oh, okay, we noticed this and then we didn't do anything. And a year later we said, here's your citation. It was, hey, we're going to check in with you periodically. And it would be either a couple of weeks, sometimes depending on the case. It was 2 months, we would check in and we would take pictures as we typically do. We would compare them. Typically when there are 2 of us, we talk between each other and we like to say, hey, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? But as Sergeant Bender said, we don't like to try to take the enforcement action on people, we want to gain voluntary compliance. And so luckily we have with most of them, but about all of these ones would be about a year.
Okay.
And we've come up with a packet, Assen came up with a packet of resources. So we hand out resource guides and try and, if it's reasonable for us to try and provide some sort of avenue for them to gain some assistance other than us, then we'll hand that to them as well and try and get them pointed in the right direction.
And one of the things I would add is we may do more civil litigation for abatement in the future with the cases that EPD has spent a year trying to get compliance on and just hasn't been able to get the property owner to comply. We are thinking about taking that next step to do the civil abatement, and that would be creating the revolving fund to fund it. Then we find cost recovery ways to replenish the fund. And so that is something we are talking about doing more moving forward with those of the most challenging cases.
And I would just add that would take council action and council approval. And so that's one of the tools we're looking at trying to potentially enhance, because we do have a couple of cases that are, will probably need to escalate.
I think a year is reasonable for even for gross things, but you know, for minor things, I remember when we passed the snow removal ordinance, part of the discussion was, you know, there are people who are elderly or unable to remove their own snow. Before taking enforcement action for those folks, we would like to, you know, give them some resources. And I think at the time, like the Boy Scouts stepped up, and there was a way to get help for folks who wanted it. And I don't know if that system is still in place, and I suspect not, but I guess it would be nice if we had partnerships with church groups or other organizations that we could call and say, this person just really can't get their lawn mowed. Can we help them? Rather than giving them a fine.
Just for clarification, I can't remember last time that we actually did find anybody for snow and ice removal. However, those partnerships come and go and with different leadership in different organizations. So we do try and do that when it's relevant. And like I said, they pop up and then then they move on. So, but that's where the reasonableness aspect comes in. And I think we do a pretty good job of that.
And I would just offer, I know there's a local Rotary Club or two that are always willing to step up and have volunteered to do so.
I would just echo the concern that Councilmember Lilquist raised about the lots, overgrown lots, and that's the major complaint that I hear. People wish we could be more proactive with that. For a lot of different reasons. I think you covered most of them. One of the things that was said to me at one point was the property values around that piece of property. People get concerned about that also.
Sure. And I think, like Chris said, our conglomeration with our newly established, well, it's been a year and a half or so, code enforcement meeting that we do monthly has really allowed us to talk to each other in different departments and make some headway in that direction. So
That's good. I did think of one other question I wanted to ask you. Is there any difference between your work and how hard it is if the property owner lives out of town, or if the property owner is in town, and do you have to deal with that very often?
we deal with a lot. There's a lot of people that own property and buildings and structures that don't live here. So it's usually just getting the initial contact, getting their information and getting in touch with them. After that, the process is the same. But, okay, thank you.
I just wanted to also say, I do support raising the life safety issues to the top, versus aesthetics, I guess, in terms of, I mean, some of our codes are not as are as important to enforce as actively, I guess.
Thank you for your time.
Else?
No, I just want to thank the staff for presenting tonight. Again, they're working really hard to do the best job that they can to work on code enforcement. So, so the issue will come back to you as we continue to work. And if you have further follow-up questions or comments, please share those.
Okay, we're going to adjourn until 1900.